Sometimes a fire that destroys a house doesn't begin in the walls. It sparks in the heart. He poured everything he had into her, yet she still walked away with her trainer. So he set everything ablaze. On a sweltering July night in 2023, neighbors poured onto their porches, eyes wide and rooted in shock by what unfolded before them. A small family home was swallowed by flames. The blaze glowed so intensely it washed the entire block in red. Furniture cracked under the heat. Windows burst like gunshots. Within minutes, the roof sagged inward as black smoke climbed into the sky. But the strangest part wasn't the fire. It was the man seated calmly at the curb, watching it all burn. No panic, no shock, no attempt to flee, just stillness. He didn't utter a word. He didn't try to defend himself. He simply sat there as a home, and everyone trapped inside crumbled to ash. By the time the sirens wailed into the block, everything was already lost. Firefighters froze, neighbors screamed, and officers turned their attention to him. And when they asked the only question that mattered, he answered with words that silenced the entire street. But who was this man? Why did he do it? And what pushes a kind-hearted man to choose flames over forgiveness? We're diving into a story of love, betrayal, and the type of rage no one ever saw coming. How far can a person be pushed before they break? This is a story of a man named Samuel Grant. And if you pass him on the street, you wouldn't think twice. He wasn't a noisy neighbor. He wasn't the guy blasting music or rolling home in a flashy car. Samuel was the man you'd see loading groceries into his trunk, maybe nodding to you at the gas station, then disappearing from your mind moments later. But anyone who paid attention knew better. Samuel wasn't ordinary at all. He was comfortable, stable, quietly wealthy in a way that didn't need applause. Born in 1971, he inherited not only his parents' small fortune, but their discipline. They taught him to build instead of waste, save instead of splurge, and guard his name at all costs. Those lessons shaped him. He owned more than most realized: properties, investments, savings that stretched quietly beneath the surface. Yet he never flaunted any of it. At 52, Samuel had never married and had no children. When asked why, he'd simply smile and say, life had other plans. He worked steady hours as a property manager and earned the loyalty of his tenants. He owned 2 rental houses outright, drove a reliable car that never gave him trouble, and kept enough in his accounts that bills never shook him. His apartment stayed tidy, his fridge always full, his days moving in a gentle rhythm that brought him peace. He had enough money to live big, but excess never tempted him. Samuel preferred simple pleasures, a good meal, a clean home, the quiet dignity of routine. Neighbors called him polite, dependable, and always added the same phrase, too kind for his own good, because Samuel gave without keeping score. He was the man who tucked a few bills into a struggling family's mailbox, the one who paid a teen $20 just for trying to fundraise, the one who fixed a fence or shoveled a driveway simply because he couldn't walk past a problem and ignore it. Picture him at his mother's bedside in her final days, spooning soup to her lips or straightening his father's blanket when he thought no one was watching. Everyone saw his devotion and whispered about how rare it was to see a man give so much with so little expectation in return. Later, those same neighbors would shake their heads and say, if only he'd been a little tougher, maybe things wouldn't have ended like this. But Samuel wasn't built for hardness. He believed good deeds return good outcomes. That belief, his blind trust in kindness, was a very crack life aimed for. For 52 years, he believed discipline and generosity could shield him. But in 2021, everything shifted. Before we walk into that storm, let me ask you something. Have you ever known a person who gave the world everything, who lived right, who helped everyone around them, and still life gave them nothing back? That was Samuel Grant. And what makes this story cut even deeper is that his downfall didn't come from strangers. It came from the very people he welcomed into his heart. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. As you follow Samuel's journey, ask yourself, what would you have done in his shoes? Would you have kept giving or walked away? Because what comes next shows just how dangerous it becomes when a man like Samuel ignores every warning sign for the sake of love, loyalty, and the dream of having a family. And then there was Tayana Branson. 28 years old, breathtaking in a way that made people forget their train of thought, yet reckless enough that those same people whispered the moment she turned her back. Sharp cheekbones, glowing skin, a body that commanded attention. Behind all that beauty was chaos. She wasn't the type of woman you associate with safety. She was the kind you associated with trouble. And still, people couldn't look away. Her name had been part of neighborhood gossip since she was 16. In 2009, she stormed out of her mother's house with a duffel bag and a fire in her chest no one could put out. She wanted freedom, not the kind that came from careers or school, but the nightlife, the affection of older men promising her everything if she just stayed close. And she did. For years she drifted between men, apartments, and quick hustles, living off charm and sad stories. She called it her baby girl lifestyle. No responsibilities. Just finding the next man willing to carry her weight. But nothing shiny stays shiny forever. In 2011, she had twins, Deshaun and Kamari. She wasn't even sure who their father was. One man claimed them, then vanished. Another insisted they weren't his. By the time the boys were old enough for school, she had already moved on. Then came Nyla in 2014, a quiet little girl who blended into the noise of her brothers. And finally, Caden in 2016, for kids by 25, for different men or maybe 3. Even Tayana didn't know. And worse, she didn't care. The house those children lived in wasn't a home. Rent hadn't been paid in 3 years. The landlord threatened eviction more times than anyone could keep track of. But Tayana always cried, pleaded, or flirted her way out of it, promising money that never came. The lights got shut off. The gas cut. Neighbors remembered seeing those kids outside in winter coats 2 sizes too small, begging others for snacks. By 10, Deshaun and Kamari fought in the streets like grown men. Nyla skipped more classes than she attended, imitating her mother's queen attitude while quietly aching for attention. And little Caden, just 7, was already learning not to cry when hunger gnawed at him. But if you scrolled through Tayana's phone, you would never know. On social media, she posted filtered selfies with captions like Queen Energy and Unbothered. Wigs from discount shops, knockoff designer bags held like trophies, cheap heels angled to look expensive, nights out with men cropped out of frame, but always present. Online, she was unstoppable. In real life, she was drowning and dragging her kids with her. Her neighbors saw the truth. They saw hungry children, overdue bills, and chaos slipping through the cracks. Even her family gave up on her. Some said she was too far gone. Others shrugged and said she always found a way to land on her feet. And somehow she did. She perfected the craft of surviving without working. A man for the phone bill, another for hair, another for groceries. When they caught on, she moved on. Now pause. Imagine living beside someone like her. Imagine watching those children roam the streets with dirty faces while she strutted past in heels, laughing into her phone. Would you have stepped in or looked the other way? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you lived 2 doors down from Tayana Branson? Because here's the dangerous truth. For all the rumors, for all the warnings, people still got pulled into her orbit. That's what happens when beauty mixes with recklessness. It blinds. She was trouble, yes, but trouble wrapped in perfume and eyeliner. Trouble with a smile that promised more than she'd ever give, and a laugh that made men feel chosen when, in reality, they were just the next name on a long list. By 2021, her life was spinning far out of control. The twins were suspended, so often the school principal practically memorized her number. Nyla learned the streets faster than she learned math. And little Caden hardened early. Quiet, hungry, and already older than his years. Through it all, Tayana kept moving like none of it was her responsibility. 28 years old for children, no plan, no job, and still carried herself like the world owed her something. Neighbors sat on porches and shook their heads. That girl ain't never gonna change, one would mutter. Shameless, another added. Yet the cars kept pulling up. Men knocked, stayed for a night, disappeared by morning. Her children saw everything. The bill slid under the door, the power cut off, the endless stream of men. They watched their mother beg one day, then dress up for the club the next. And from that chaos, they learned not how to build a life, but how to hustle without caring about tomorrow. And this whirlwind of beauty and neglect, is the woman Samuel Grant was about to cross paths with. This was a storm he'd soon step into. A man of order, discipline, and savings, standing at the edge of a chaos he believed he could calm. But we're not there yet. For now, hold on to this picture of Tiana. The beauty, the hunger, the unpaid bills, the children raising themselves. Because when Samuel stepped into her world, he wasn't just entering her life. He was walking straight into a trap he never saw coming. So let me ask you again. If you were Samuel, would you have helped or walked away? Most of us think we know what we would do. But Samuel was about to show the world what happens when a kind heart collides with a woman like Tiana Branson. In December 2021, Samuel moved into the neighborhood where Tiana lived, hoping for a quieter life. He'd spent the last year in an apartment near downtown, where traffic noise and constant movement had worn him thin. He wanted peace, a steady rhythm in a place where neighbors kept to themselves, where he could enjoy walking to the grocery store, watering the patch of grass in front of his home, and exchanging polite nods without getting too close. He believed this neighborhood would give him that. What he didn't know was that just 2 blocks away, a door he never expected to open would change the entire course of his life. It was a chilly December afternoon when Samuel first saw them, for children huddled together on a porch, tears streaking their faces, little arms wrapped around one another like they were their only shield from the world. He froze mid-step, grocery bags digging into his palms, unable to look away. These weren't children who had scraped their knees. These were children the world had already forgotten. Clothes wrinkled, shoes worn thin, eyes swollen from hours of crying. For Samuel, the sight was haunting. Something inside him stirred, an ache he thought had long been buried, a longing for connection, for purpose, for belonging. He set his bags on the curb and walked over. "You kids okay?" he asked softly, his voice warm and controlled as always. They didn't answer at first. They only stared at him with the kind of suspicion children learn when adults have failed them too many times. Then little Caden broke the silence. "We're hungry," he whispered, barely audible, as though ashamed to admit it. Samuel's chest tightened. He opened one of the grocery bags and pulled out a pack of sandwiches he'd bought for himself. Without thinking, he handed them over. The children snatched the food and ate quickly, crumbs scattering across their laps. And in that moment, something shifted in Samuel. It wasn't planned or logical, but deep in his heart, he felt it. He couldn't walk away. That small act of kindness, insignificant to him but life-altering to them, pulled him in. And Tiana? She played her part perfectly. She realized she had caught a big fish, one that would change her life. She saw Samuel as heaven sent and vowed silently never to let him slip away. Within weeks, Samuel found himself showing up more and more. It started with small things, an extra bag of groceries, clothes to replace the children's worn-out outfits. But the needs were endless, and Samuel had both the heart and the savings to meet them. Every day he told himself, this is the last time. And every day it continued. Soon he was paying off years of back rent, sliding cash to a landlord who had nearly given up hope. He covered utility bills. Lights flickered back on. Because of him, he paid school fees, bought shoes, stocked pantries. He made sure the kids had meals every night. It didn't take long for Samuel to become the family's lifeline. And the truth? He didn't mind. For the first time in decades, he felt needed. He felt like he belonged to something. He drove the kids to school, listened to their chatter fill the car, and realized how cold his life had been before they arrived. When they called him Uncle Sam, something inside him softened. By mid-2022, Samuel had crossed far beyond groceries and school rides. He went to the bank, withdrew the funds, and paid off the mortgage on a modest home for Tiana and her children. He bought her a reliable car, though he quickly noticed she never used it for school or errands. He did all that. He carried the household. He provided the stability. And he convinced himself the kids finally had a real chance. But not everyone saw him as noble. Neighborhood whispers grew louder. She's using you. She's gonna bleed you dry. She ain't changing. He heard it all. He ignored it all. Told himself he wasn't doing it for her, but for the kids. Told himself it wasn't weakness. It was love. Told himself people were bitter and couldn't understand what it meant to finally be needed after a lifetime of being invisible. But deep down, Samuel knew the truth. He wasn't just doing it for the children. He was doing it for her. Even though she never promised marriage, never promised forever, never promised anything. Only one person cared enough to try stopping him. Mrs. Lorraine Jacobs, an elderly woman who had lived there for 30 years. She pulled him aside one afternoon when she saw him carrying groceries into Tayana's house. "Son, I know you got a good heart," she said, voice soft but heavy with warning. "But good hearts get broken the worst. That girl ain't changing just because you're saving her. You can't save people who don't want to save themselves." Samuel smiled, thanked her, and dismissed her completely. He thought she didn't see what he saw. The children laughing when he arrived. The smile on Tayana's face when another bill was paid. He believed he was building something real, something that would one day become a family. And this is where the tension begins. Because Samuel wasn't just helping anymore, he was sacrificing. He drained the savings he'd spent decades building. He gave his time, energy, peace. He poured his entire life into Tayana's world, ignoring every red flag and whispered warning. Why? Because he was lonely. Because he wanted love. Because he believed he had finally found a family that needed him as much as he needed them. Sometimes love blinds us to warnings. And sometimes loneliness becomes the most dangerous lie we tell ourselves. Let me ask you this. Do you think Samuel was a fool for giving so much to a woman like Tiana? Or was he simply a man desperate to belong? Even if it cost him everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because from this point on, the choices Samuel made would lead him down a road that no one, not even the neighbors who tried to warn him, could have imagined. Tiana, however, grew arrogant. Instead of showing gratitude, she flaunted Samuel's money as if she had earned it herself. She strutted online constantly, phone glued to her hand, lips puckered, filters smoothing out her face. Every post, every caption was crafted to make her look like she had worked hard for the life she was living. She snapped photos inside the car Samuel bought, never tagging him, never saying thank you. She posted selfies with the kids dressed in new outfits, pretending the shopping bags came from her paycheck instead of his savings. On Instagram, she called herself blessed, as if blessings just drifted from the sky. Meanwhile, Samuel quietly watched his bank account drain. Neighbors would scroll past her photos and laugh bitterly. "That man is the reason she's smiling," they'd whisper, but you'd never know it from the way she tells it. Yet the arrogance in her walk was impossible to miss. She carried herself like a woman who had finally made it, though everyone knew she hadn't worked a single day for any of it. And while Samuel should have felt embarrassed, he wasn't. He watched from the background, convinced that if he kept pouring into her life, one day she would finally recognize his worth. In his mind, love was patient, and patience would pay off. But the cracks were already there. Even the children he had rescued from hunger and humiliation began mocking him. It started small. Jokes about his age, the way he walked slower than other men, the gray along his temples. Samuel shrugged it off, but soon their words cut deeper. They teased the car he drove, comparing it to the flashier rides of younger men. They called him old-fashioned and boring. At first, he pretended it didn't hurt, but inside it did. He had sacrificed so much for them, yet they treated him like he was nothing more than a punchline at the dinner table. Then came the moment that made the entire block shake their heads. One afternoon, Samuel stopped by with groceries as usual. The kids played in the living room while Tiana lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone without looking up. Caden, the youngest, had somehow gotten hold of a kitchen knife. No one knew why. Maybe he was playing, maybe he was testing boundaries. But in his small hands, that blade was no toy. Samuel approached gently. "Put that down, son. You'll hurt yourself." But before he could take it away, Caden stumbled forward and the knife pierced Samuel's arm. Blood flowed fast, running down his sleeve, dripping on the floor. The room froze. The older kids gasped. Nyla screamed. Even Tiana sat up for the first time that evening. Neighbors heard the commotion and rushed onto the porch, and within minutes the story spread across the entire street. But Samuel didn't shout. He didn't curse. He pressed his hand against the wound, forced a smile, and said, "Kids will be kids." It was just a silly mistake. That's how he described it. Just a mistake. As if a blade slicing into his flesh was the same as a child spilling milk. He waved off calls for an ambulance. Even though the bleeding wouldn't stop, he patched himself up and went right back to unloading groceries. Neighbors shook their heads in disbelief. "That man's too soft for his own good," someone muttered. Another said, "He'll give until he's got nothing left." But Samuel brushed it all aside. One neighbor, braver than the rest, pulled him aside a few days later. "Why haven't you walked away?" she asked. "You're bleeding for people who don't care whether you live or die." Samuel only sighed, wearing that same polite smile. "They're just kids," he said quietly. "They need someone, and I could be that someone." He didn't add what weighed on him the most, that his loneliness pressed on him like a stone. Every morning he woke up to silence that almost crushed him. Being around those kids, even with the hurt and the chaos, made him feel alive. It made him feel needed. But that loneliness was also his blind spot, because while Samuel held on to hope, believing that kindness would someday be enough, everyone else saw what he refused to face. Tiana wasn't changing. She was basking in the glow of his sacrifices, flaunting every dime he gave while treating him as nothing more than a background extra in her story. She laughed loudly in the living room, phone in hand, bragging to her followers about how good her life was now, while Samuel quietly washed blood out his shirt at his own sink. She strutted in the shoes he bought, posed inside the house he secured, yet never once credited him. To her, Samuel wasn't a man to appreciate. He was a resource to use. And here's where I want you to pause and think. If it had been you, if a child you fed, clothed, and put back in school stabbed you in the arm, if you were mocked and dismissed while giving everything you had, would you have stayed? Or would you have walked away? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is a part of the story where most people agree Samuel should have left. But he didn't. He stayed. And that choice, his refusal to see the truth, will be the very reason everything spiraled the way it did. Samuel clung to the belief that love and consistency could fix anything, that if he stayed long enough, gave enough, proved himself enough, gratitude would replace arrogance, and respect would replace mockery. But he didn't realize the more he gave, the more he taught them to take. And the more they took, the further he drifted from the peaceful life he once had. Toward the end of 2022, tragedy struck. Samuel suffered a stroke that changed everything. The once strong, reliable man was left partially paralyzed, confined to a wheelchair. One moment he was walking to his car with groceries balanced in both arms, and the next his body betrayed him. His right side went heavy, his words slurred, and before he knew it, he was waking up in a hospital bed as doctors explained that his independence was gone. The man who once stood tall and steady was now unable to stand at all. For the first time in years, Samuel couldn't even walk across a room. The same man who had carried the weight of everyone else's life now needed others just to move from place to place. Lying in that bed, Samuel told himself it was temporary. He believed therapy and patience would bring him back to strength. But as the weeks passed, reality settled over him like a heavy blanket. Life had changed in a way he couldn't undo. That's when the loneliness he had never spoken of hit him harder than ever. He thought about his parents, long gone. The nights he had gone home to an empty apartment. The mornings he had woken up to silence. And then he thought of Tiana and the children. The family he had tried to build out of nothing. They were his only hope now, his reason to keep going. So when the hospital discharged him, he made a choice. He wouldn't return to his quiet apartment 2 blocks away. Instead, he would move into the very house he had paid for, the house where Tiana and her children lived. He told himself it made sense. It wasn't just about being near them. It was about having someone there to help him recover. He imagined the kids learning compassion, helping with groceries, maybe even pushing his wheelchair to the porch so he could feel the sun again. He imagined Tiana finally putting her phone down, giving even a fraction of the care he had poured into her life. He pictured her sitting beside him, offering comfort, maybe even sharing a laugh, the family finding the balance he had always dreamed of. He believed, truly believed, that this hardship might be the thing that brought them closer. But he was wrong. This was when Tayana revealed who she really was. Instead of tending to the man who had carried her world, she mocked him behind closed doors. She rolled her eyes whenever he asked for help. To her friends, she laughed and said she was too young to be tied down with an old man. She told them she hadn't signed up to play nurse, hadn't agreed to waste her 20s pushing a wheelchair. Her words tore straight through Samuel's soul, because sometimes she didn't whisper them behind his back. Sometimes she said them directly to his face. The same woman whose mortgage he paid, whose children he fed, looked him in the eyes and said she was embarrassed to be seen in public with him. Whatever little gratitude she once pretended to have evaporated, she treated him like an inconvenience. If he dropped something, she wouldn't bend down to pick it up. If he asked for food, she acted like he was interrupting her life. Some nights, she didn't bother cooking at all. He went to bed hungry, too weak to wheel himself into the kitchen, while she posted online with plates of food she bought only for herself. And the children followed her lead. Instead of showing compassion, they avoided him. They giggled when he struggled. They whispered that he was slow now. Samuel, the man who gave them back their childhood, sat in the corner of the home he paid for, listening as their laughter turned cold. Neighbors noticed. Mrs. Lorraine Jacobs, the elderly woman who once warned him, would see him sitting by the window and shake her head, tears in her eyes. Others murmured that Samuel deserved better, but they never said it to him. They saw how he still tried, still offered polite smiles, still wheeled himself onto the porch like everything was normal. But his eyes told the truth. His hope was breaking. Samuel's days became a cycle of humiliation and silence. He woke early, as he always had, but now every movement was a struggle. He'd wait for someone to notice he needed help. Most days, no one did. He'd sit in the living room while Tayana scrolled her phone, nails done, hair fresh, outfit new, and listen as she bragged to friends about how well she was living, never mentioning that every bit existed because of him. If he asked for anything, she sighed loudly so everyone could hear her annoyance. But here's what cuts deepest. Samuel still held on to hope, even when she mocked him, even when the kids laughed at him, even when she told her friends she was ashamed of him. He still believed something might change. He blamed the stress of his condition. He told himself the kids would mature. He told himself love could still grow, even in a house where cruelty had taken root. And this is where I want you to pause and think. If you were Samuel, sitting in that wheelchair in the house you paid for, listening to the woman you loved call you a burden, would you have stayed? Would you have clung to hope? Or would you have rolled yourself out the front door and never looked back? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this was the moment Samuel's heart should have let go. But it didn't. By early 2023, the contrast in that home was unbearable. Samuel, once strong and respected, was now shrinking in that chair, his body failing him. And Tayana, once broke and desperate, now strutted with more arrogance than ever, flaunting the life he built for her. The power had shifted completely. And Samuel, blind to what everyone else saw, stayed. His hope was all he had left, and that hope was about to destroy him. In March 2023, Tayana joined a gym. She claimed she wanted her body back. That it was about health, about being a better example for kids. But the truth had nothing to do with treadmills or meal plans. The gym across town, flashy, loud, mirrors everywhere, was where she met him. Darius Hall, 29, broad shoulders, a smooth smile, a voice like velvet, the kind of man who knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't have to try. His arms flexed just right. His charm dripped into every conversation. His attention made women feel chosen. It didn't take long for Tayana to notice him, and even less time for him to notice her. To him, she was an opportunity. To her, he was an escape. Within 1 week, she was staying after workouts, laughing with Darius in the parking lot while her kids fended for themselves at home. Within 2 weeks, she was sneaking out at night, leaving Samuel in his wheelchair at the window, watching headlights disappear into the dark. By the end of March, she wasn't hiding it. Neighbors whispered when they saw her riding around with a man who wasn't Samuel. Some said she glowed differently. Others said she looked reckless. But the moment that shook the block came one Saturday morning. Samuel's own car, paid for by him, pulled into the driveway, and Darius was behind the wheel. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. That car had always been Samuel's pride, the one he washed carefully every weekend. Now a stranger drove it like it belonged to him. By April 2023, Darius wasn't just visiting. He was living inside Samuel's house, sleeping in Samuel's bed, eating at Samuel's table, walking through Samuel's halls as if he owned them. For Samuel, it was a new level of humiliation. Too weak to fight, too weary to leave. He sat silently in his chair, watching his world be overtaken by a man 15 years younger, a man who had contributed nothing. The children quickly adjusted. The same kids who once called him Uncle Sam now mocked his frailty. They laughed at his wheelchair, ignored his words, and started calling Darius Dad. The word stabbed him every time. Imagine sitting in the house you paid for, watching another man relax on the furniture you bought, while the children you rescued dismiss you like you don't exist. Imagine hearing the woman you sacrificed everything for laugh louder with another man than she ever did with you. That was Samuel's life. Day after day, night after night, his silence wasn't acceptance. It was survival, but inside he was breaking. By then, the betrayal wasn't subtle. It was blatant, loud, and constant. And Samuel, held hostage by his own kindness, could do nothing but watch as his life was handed to someone else. The final humiliation came in June 2023. Tayana called the police and told them Samuel needed to be removed from the house. Her voice wasn't frantic. It wasn't emotional. It was cold, almost businesslike. She told the dispatcher that an unwanted man was refusing to leave her property. She didn't say his name. She didn't mention the years of sacrifice he poured into that home. She didn't acknowledge that without him, she and her children would still be living in darkness. To her, he was now a nuisance. When the patrol cars arrived, the whole block stepped onto their porches. Flashing lights washed across the houses like a cruel spotlight. Samuel, weak in his chair, was pushed out by officers who had no idea he was a quiet hero of that neighborhood. His belongings, 2 bags of clothes, a couple of framed photos, his mother's Bible, were placed on a porch like trash waiting for pickup. Neighbors were stunned. Some covered their mouths. Others whispered, "Is she really doing this?" And there was Tayana, standing in the doorway, arms folded, face cold. "He doesn't live here anymore," she told the officers. "This is my house." No shame, no second thoughts, not a shred of gratitude. Samuel turned his head toward her, searching her face one last time. She stared straight through him. The children peeked from behind her legs, silent. They had once clung to Samuel, begged him for food, cried in his arms. Now they looked at him like he was a stranger being removed from their home. The neighbors felt sick. Some wanted to speak up, but none did. They simply watched as Samuel was wheeled down the porch and to the curb. That's when Charles Bennett, the man from 3 houses down, stepped forward. Charles was in his 60s, a man of few words, known for keeping to himself. But that night, he couldn't stay silent. As the officers unloaded Samuel's bags and turned back toward their car, Charles walked over. He looked at Samuel, then at the officers, then back at Samuel again. "Come on, let me take you home," he said gently, placing his hand on Samuel's shoulder. His voice was the only kindness Samuel heard that night. The officers left, and the block fell into a heavy silence. Charles pushed Samuel's chair slowly down the street, past the stairs, past the whispers, past the very neighbors who had warned him long ago. Samuel didn't say a word. His head hung low, his eyes fixed on the pavement, as if lifting them would only remind him of all the faces watching his shame. Each turn of the wheel seemed louder than the last. Charles carried the weight of the moment, steadying the chair while the man inside it sank deeper into silence. When they reached Samuel's old apartment, Charles helped him inside. The small space was tidy, the way Samuel had always kept it, but now it felt empty, hollow. Charles set his bags down near the couch, looked him in the eye, and said, "You don't deserve this, Sam. Not after everything." Samuel managed a faint nod, but his voice cracked when he whispered, "Thank you." Charles didn't push for more. He gave him a firm pat on the shoulder, promised to check in later, and left quietly, closing the door behind him. That door click echoed in the silence. Samuel sat in the middle of his apartment, his wheelchair parked near the window, staring at the bags of belongings that were supposed to represent a life. They looked pitiful, like scraps left behind. He thought about the years of hard work, the money he had saved, the sacrifices he had made. He thought about the kids, the sandwiches on that cold December day, the school rides, the birthdays he had paid for, the lights he had turned back on with his own wallet. And now, in June 2023, all of that was gone. In its place, humiliation. His heart, one so soft, one so full of patience, began to harden. The love that had driven him to give so freely twisted into something darker. He replayed Tayana's face in his mind. The coldness, the arrogance, the way she looked at him like he was disposable. He thought of the kids' silence, how quickly they let go of the man who saved them. He thought of the neighbors' stares, the pity in their eyes, the whispers that followed him down the street. Every image carved into him, leaving marks no one could see. That night, Samuel sat in his room, his heart hardened. The weight of everything pressed on him. The loneliness he had carried for years had now fused with rage. For the first time in his life, Samuel wasn't thinking about patience or kindness or second chances. He was thinking about the fire inside him, the kind no water could put out. For weeks, he sat alone in his room, staring at receipts and bank statements, proof of every sacrifice. Each line on the paper told a story. Mortgage payments that weren't for his comfort, but for hers. Utility bills he had cleared again and again. Grocery totals that fed children who now mocked him openly. Car payments for the vehicle she handed to another man. Those numbers weren't just transactions anymore. They were scars. And as Samuel read them over and over, he realized they were also evidence of a life he had given away piece by piece, until nothing was left for himself. But the numbers weren't the worst part. The worst part was the sound of their voices. He had started recording conversations earlier, not because he was planning anything, but because he needed to hear the truth when his own mind tried to convince him he was overreacting. On his phone, he played those clips late into the night. Tayana laughing, her tone sharp and heartless, saying, "I got him wrapped around my finger. He'll do whatever I want." Darius chiming in, his voice smug and careless. "Man's nothing but an ATM with wheels." Then laughter, cruel, loud, cutting straight through Samuel's chest every time. He replayed it again and again until the words weren't just sounds anymore. They were fuel. Sitting in the dim light of his apartment in late June 2023, Samuel whispered to himself, "I gave them everything." And they laughed. Those words became his mantra. Every time his hand trembled, every time his conscience tried to soften, that recording hardened him again. He had no one left to call. His parents were gone. His neighbors had warned him, then stood back. And so, in his loneliness, his mind began to draw lines he had never thought possible. At first, it was just a thought, one he brushed away quickly. But thoughts, when replayed enough, become seeds. And those seeds, when watered by anger and humiliation, grow roots. By the first week of July 2023, Samuel wasn't just angry anymore. He was deliberate. He began buying gasoline in small amounts, careful never to draw attention. A few dollars here, a few dollars there, 1 gallon from a station across town, another from the one near his apartment. Never enough to raise suspicion. He kept the containers hidden under a tarp in the back of his storage closet. The smell strong enough to sting his nose every time he opened the door. He stacked the receipts neatly in an envelope. Maybe part of him wanted the world to know just how calculated this was. Or maybe he wanted to leave behind proof that this wasn't madness. It was intention. Each night, Samuel mapped the hours of the house he once called home. He knew when the kids gathered in the living room, when Tayana disappeared upstairs with Darius, when the lights dimmed, and when the noise finally settled. He watched from a distance, sometimes wheeling himself to a spot where he could see shadows flicker through the curtains, his face hidden in the dark. From there, he saw Darius drive his car, laugh on his porch, sleep in his bed, and each time Samuel whispered to himself, "I gave him everything," and they laughed. His plan grew sharper with every passing day. He would wait until the house was full, until every soul that had mocked him was inside. He wasn't thinking of saving anyone or leaving room for escape. No, this wasn't about warning. This was about finality, about making sure the same walls that had seen his humiliation would now see his vengeance. By the night of July 7th, 2023, Samuel had made up his mind completely. Neighbors would later say he looked calm, almost too calm, as he rolled his chair down the cracked sidewalk toward Tayana's home. The air was heavy, the kind of summer night where every sound seemed amplified. The chirping of crickets, the hum of air conditioners, the faint music from cars passing by. Samuel didn't flinch at any of it. His face was steady, his eyes fixed on the house that had once been his sanctuary and was now his target. When he reached the porch, he didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. The front door was unlocked, just as it often was, because Tayana had never cared much for security. He wheeled himself inside, the quiet hum of his chair blending with the low murmur of voices from upstairs. The children were in the living room, sprawled on the couch, half watching a show on television. They barely looked at him. To them, he was no longer important. Just the old man in the corner. Samuel glanced at them briefly, but his face gave nothing away. He rolled past them slowly, methodically, carrying a container on his lap. At the base of the staircase, he paused, listening. Tayana's laughter drifted down, Darius's voice rumbling close behind. The sound wasn't sharp this time. It was light, playful, carefree, and somehow that was worse. Samuel reached the container, unscrewed the cap, and tilted it to the floor. Gasoline splashed onto the carpet, darkening it instantly. The smell filled the air, sharp and choking. But he didn't cough. He didn't waver. He moved with purpose. He wheeled himself along the hall, pouring trails across doorways, walls, furniture. Curtains soaked quickly. Couches absorbed it like sponges. Every corner became a fuse. He moved through the kitchen, along the back door, through the dining room. The children shifted uneasily now, sensing something was off. One of them muttered, "What's that smell?" But Samuel didn't answer. He just kept pouring, his movement steady, as if rehearsed 100 times in his mind. Upstairs, laughter continued. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly, but no one came down. They didn't know that beneath them, Samuel was writing the last chapter of their story. When the final container was empty, he placed it aside, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a box of matches. His hand trembled, not from doubt, but from the weakness of his body. He steadied it, striking one against the side of the box. The flame flared, small but fierce, illuminating his face for just a moment. His eyes reflected the fire before he let it fall. The match hit the gasoline-soaked carpet, and in an instant, the flames roared to life. They spread with terrifying speed, racing along the trails he had laid, climbing the curtains, leaping onto walls, swallowing furniture. Heat filled the room. Smoke thickened the air. The quiet living room turned into an inferno. The children screamed, their voices cutting to the crackle of fire. Upstairs, footsteps thundered as Tayana and Darius realized what was happening. Chaos erupted, but Samuel didn't move. He turned his chair toward the front door, wheeled himself calmly outside, and rolled down to the curb. Neighbors poured out of their houses, shouting, panicked. Some grabbing hoses, others calling 911. Firefighters raced down the street minutes later, sirens screaming into the night. But it was too late. The flames had already consumed the house, climbing higher and higher until the roof collapsed inward. The screams faded into the roar of destruction. Nothing was saved. And there, at the edge of it all, Samuel sat in his wheelchair, silent. His face showed no fear, no panic, not even relief, just a hollow calmness. When police arrived and rushed toward him, shouting questions, he didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply lifted his eyes to them and said the only words that mattered anymore. "I gave them everything." The block went quiet. Even the firefighters, covered in sweat and ash, turned to look at him. Those 5 words carried the weight of years. The story of sacrifice turned into rage. Kindness twisted into destruction. And in that moment, Samuel was no longer just a man. He was a warning. Samuel was let out with handcuffs, the orange glow of the fire still painting the night sky behind him. His head was lowered, his body weak from the weight of the moment, but his face was calm, almost too calm, like a man who had finally finished a long battle. The crowd that had gathered on the street watched silently, some with tears streaming down their faces. For months, they had seen Samuel will himself down this block, carrying groceries, driving kids to school, fixing problems that weren't his. And now, they watched as officers gripped his arms, guiding him toward the back of a police car. A single tear rolled down his cheek, glistening in the flashing red and blue lights. It was the only time he allowed himself to break, the only sign that deep inside, even now, there was still a man who once believed kindness could save him. Neighbors cried openly. Mrs. Lorraine Jacobs, the elderly woman who had tried to warn him, covered her mouth as her eyes filled. Charles Bennett, the one who had helped him return to his apartment after Tayana threw him out, whispered to himself, he didn't deserve this. Not like this. But it was too late. Samuel, the man they once called too kind for his own good, was now being wheeled away as a criminal. The streets that once knew him as a quiet, dependable neighbor now saw him as the man responsible for a house full of bodies and ashes. 2 months later, in September 2023, the trial began. Reporters filled the courthouse. Attorneys sharpened their arguments, and the entire community buzzed with debate. To some, Samuel was a monster, a cold-blooded killer who had taken innocent lives. To others, he was a broken man, a victim of betrayal and humiliation, pushed to the very edge. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution wasted no time painting him as dangerous. They held up the receipts for the gasoline, line after line of purchases made in the weeks leading up to the fire. They showed the containers pulled from a storage closet, each one reeking of fuel. They described in graphic detail the way flames had swallowed the house, how neighbors had heard the screams, how firefighters had found nothing but charred remains. They pointed at him directly, calling him calculated, deliberate, merciless. He planned mass murder, the prosecutor thundered. He waited until the house was full. He knew the children were inside. He wanted them to burn. Their words cut deep, filling the courtroom with images too painful to erase. But the defense told a different story. They spoke of Samuel as a man destroyed by love and betrayal. They played the recordings of Tayana mocking him, Darius laughing as he called him an ATM with wheels. They pulled out bank statements showing the thousands he had spent to keep that family alive. They brought neighbors to the stand who described him as generous, dependable, the kind of man who never said no when someone was in need. One witness choked up as she said, he wasn't a killer. He was lonely. He just wanted to belong. The defense didn't deny that Samuel had lit the fire. They admitted it openly, but they asked the jury to see the man behind the act. A man crushed under years of being used, humiliated, and abandoned. The trial stretched for days, each side battling fiercely. Some jurors wiped tears as they listened to testimonies about his kindness. Others looked cold, unmoved, when the prosecution showed pictures of the burned remains of 4 children. The weight of both stories hung in the air like a storm. Was he a monster? Or was he a man who had simply been pushed too far? After 12 long hours of deliberation, the jury returned. On September 14th, 2023, they delivered the verdict. Guilty of arson and multiple counts of murder. The words echoed in the courtroom, sealing Samuel's fate. Some gasped, others nodded grimly. But Samuel himself didn't flinch. He sat still, his hands folded in his lap, his face calm once more. At sentencing, the judge asked if he had anything to say. The room fell silent. Samuel raised his head, looked straight ahead, and spoke clearly, his voice steady. I love them more than myself, and they left me to die. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a plea. It was a truth, simple and haunting. Then the gavel struck, and Samuel Grant was sentenced to 120 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, the community was torn apart. In barbershops, people argued about whether justice had been served. In churches, preachers used the story as a warning about what bitterness can do to a soul. At kitchen tables, families whispered late into the night, asking themselves, would I have stayed? Would I have helped? Could that have been me? Some called him a monster who murdered children. Others called him a victim of betrayal, who snapped when there was nothing left to lose. And here's where I want to ask you, what do you think? Was Samuel a man pushed past his limits, or was he always destined for fire? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this isn't a story with easy answers. This is a story that forces us to look at kindness, loyalty, and betrayal in ways that make us uncomfortable. When betrayal cuts deep, how far would you go? If kindness turns into weakness, who's really to blame? The one who gave too much, or the one who took it all and laughed? These are the questions Samuel's story leaves behind. One thing is certain. His story will never be forgotten. It is a story of love turned sour, sacrifice twisted into humiliation, and rage that ended not with words, but with fire. If you're drawn to stories like this, where love, betrayal, and obsession collide, be sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. This is Ruthless Realities. Until next time,